My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and the grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. Today we have a rather curious account about two prophets in the Old Testament. It appears in the first reading in the book of Kings. First we have this figure, this famous prophet, Elijah, one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. He was active in the northern kingdom of Israel during the 9th century BC. He lived under King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And perhaps you remember him. He's very famous for his dramatic confrontation with these terrible prophets of Baal, whom he eventually completely destroyed. But what is interesting here is that his best known disciple and successor is the prophet Elisha. So we got Elijah and Elisha. And Elisha, he became really a stellar prophet. Like at one point he purified all the waters in this poisoned well. He's the guy who healed Naaman of his leprosy. So we get the last moments of Elijah's life in today's reading. And we just get a little glimpse of him on earth there as he hands on his mission over to his successor, Elisha. So we get this scene now, picture it now. Elijah, he's getting old, he's approaching the end of his earthly mission, getting weaker. And he decides to cross the Jordan. And he approaches Jericho, and he's there with Elisha. Elisha, his follower, his very just closest, beloved disciple. Elisha is sensing, the end is coming near, and he stays very close to him. And he tells him, "I promise I will never leave you." And then he asks Elijah, he says, "Please, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says, well, you're asking for a pretty hard thing. So they keep walking. They're walking, talking together. And then we get this, out of nowhere, a flaming chariot with horses comes between them. And Elijah is taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. Just picture a flaming chariot taking Elijah up with horses. It's literally a chariot of fire. Remember like that movie, Chariots of Fire there, back in the day? So Elisha, seeing him fly up, he kind of panics and he screams out, my father, Israel's chariot and Israel's drivers." And when Elijah is already far off, Elijah tears off a part of his mantle and throws it down for Elisha to catch. So Elisha picks up Elijah's fallen mantle and he kind of rolls it up, and he uses that to cross the Jordan. He taps the waters, and the waters separate, and he's able to go kind of move on. He had received a double portion of Elijah's inheritance. This expression, double portion, for the Jews, it didn't mean twice as much. It really meant an inheritance, like the firstborn would receive an inheritance. So as Elijah is carried forward into heaven, Elisha stays behind with his mantle. It's kind of like an inheritance. And since Elijah was taken up like that, it was thought that since he didn't die normally, it was thought that he would return again. In fact, people asked themselves when Jesus appeared whether he was maybe Elijah, or maybe John the Baptist was Elijah. And later on we would see, in fact, that Elijah would indeed appear with Jesus and Moses in the Transfiguration. So Elijah was a very famous figure in that sense. But it's Elisha who is the principal heir of Elijah's spirit. He felt this deep conviction that he had to take on this mission, that portion of the prophet's spirit that is his charism and carried on. And so, what does he do with this mantle? The mantle that he received from the great prophet. Well, it was not put in a vitrine. It was not put in a museum. It really was a mantle that was meant to signify prophetic authority. It implied a divine vocation. It implied a duty to transmit the charism of Elijah, a kind of sign of the continuity of this divine teaching that Elijah had dedicated his life to. So now it's Elisha who's doing it. Now I remember in Rome, I had the chance to visit the room that was said to have been used by St. Ignatius of Loyola when he was in Rome. It was a tiny little room, and you could see his personal effects there. And among the effects that I remember is his leather shoes that dated back, like way back there to the 16th century. And these were pretty small shoes, but they were full of holes. And in fact, pieces had been torn off. And they were now behind a glass, and there was a little explanation saying that these were the shoes of St. Ignatius of Loyola. They used to be larger, but over the years, pilgrims used to come and tear pieces off to bring them home as relics. That's why they were all like torn apart. Normally, they would have been better shoes that would have been kept in better order, but so they kept those as relics. And indeed, relics are good, but only if they impel us further and to be more zealous, as was the case with Elisha. And to be more zealous and to be as holy as somebody, in this case, like St. Ignatius of Loyola. And all of us can see how today, perhaps in our few minutes of prayer with Jesus, we can ask ourselves, how seriously have I taken up responsibility to carry out my mission on this earth, to carry the mantle that has been handed down to me by my baptism, by my parents, by the saints that have preceded me, that have been examples to me. Lord, show me now, give me the grace to see how responsible I have been. Because any inheritance is a very important responsibility for me. We have to do something good with all that we have received in our faith. Just to transmit the truth of the gospel to those around us, whether they're at work or at school or in our home. I like to picture that mantle, that cloak, as something precious that we have a duty to preserve, but also really a duty to make it bear fruit. When Elisha received Elijah's mantle, he took it and he struck the waters of the Jordan, and they split and they divided so he could move forward, And later on he got many, many graces because he held on to that mantle, not as a good luck charm, but as an inheritance that he received to move forward. Now that figure of Elijah appears in the early Christian catacombs, although he's not, that figure is not as common as, say, figures like Jonah and Daniel or the figure of the Good Shepherd. But the early Christians, they were attracted to the figure of Elijah because he was seen as a model of the prophetic faith, as a miracle worker, and a figure associated with the resurrection and heavenly glory, because he was like taken up like that to heaven. So, it was seen like a premonition in some ways of the resurrection of the Lord himself. But it's thanks to Elisha, that we know about Elijah. And if we connect this with today's Sermon on the Mount that we see in the Gospel, well, Jesus warns us against practicing righteousness, he says, before men and in order to be seen by them. Just practice our righteousness just before men to be seen, like almost as though we were doing it for personal gain. And indeed, we must live the faith with its integrity, but with this sense of responsibility, not just for our private interests. Our response will be seen by God, who sees in the heart. He will see our apostolic efforts, our desire to be good disciples, our prayer for others, and he will bless that. And so you and I, we all have in some way received the same great mantle, that great cloak from Elijah. We were like Elisha. We have to do something good with that cloak. Let us see how we can pass on these divine gifts to others. Maybe strike the stagnant waters around us like Elisha did, so that we too can be instruments of helping others embrace the truth of the faith and spread the truth further. I thank you, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations that you've communicated to me in this meditation. I ask your help to put them into effect. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.